Welcome to this special podcast brought to you by the Kyndryl Institute and the Innovation Show. We are at an interesting point in time with likely the most powerful technology to ever grace the planet. It is a reshuffling of how work is done, value is created, and permission is granted. It is a puzzling time for leaders as their initial temptation is to use AI to optimize existing processes. Luckily for you and for us, we have a diverse panel of experts, authors, and practitioners to shine some light on the challenges and the opportunities ahead. It is a pleasure to welcome to the show Usman Sheikh, who is the author of Framebreak and the MD of High Output Ventures. It's great to have you with us, Usman.
Great to be here, Aidan. Long-time follower. Glad to be on the show.
Great to have you on the show. Also, good friend of the show, prolific author, globally recognized expert on strategy and innovation. Her work goes back decades. She's influenced so many of us, so many people all over the world, saved companies that she doesn't even know that she saved. She is the author of multiple titles and a new book coming down the line. She is Rita McGrath. Welcome to the show.
A pleasure to be here, Aidan.
Always great to learn from you, Rita. And another person I've learned from, a person I met during the pandemic because he was in lockdown, because it's hard to lock him down. He's traveling all over the world. He's an SVP at Kyndryl now, but he wrote a brilliant book, From Incremental to Exponential. He is Ismail Amla. Welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Aidan. I'm very excited to be here with this panel.
And finally, friend of the show and good friend. He's become a good friend of mine. He's the creator of the business model canvas. He's written tons of books. He's always out in the field, working with clients, learning from clients, and leading his own business as CEO of Strategyzer. Alexander Osterwalder, welcome to the panel.
Thanks for having me, Aidan, and thank you for organizing this conversation. It's awesome.
It is, and I've told you before, I'm so selfish with this. I learn so much from both the discussions with you individually, but also I love the interaction that happens and the learning that happens between us, because we have a group of humble leaders here who are open to learning as well. I thought we'd get kicked off with something. I had a chat behind the scenes with Ismail recently, and Ismail, you casually, I hope you remember this, you casually said something that I thought would spark us today and talk to some of the things we'll discuss, when you shared how this technology is somewhat different and it's changing the structure of organization and the structure of decision making in organizations.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we all talk about this technology being life-changing, literally. And by the way, I'm a great fan of the work that Rita has done over the years. And if you think about strategy, it's difficult to think about technology being so dominant in that strategy discussion as it is today. And then if you double click just one level, you then very quickly gets to, but this isn't about bolting technology on to make change. This is about rewiring everything. And I think that is really the fundamental discussion that not all organizations and individuals have got to, but really that's where the value will come from. I think that's the sort of chat we were having.
When you said that to me, I thought about a learning that I had as a child. My granny was brilliant at teaching me the hard way. And she said, I'd give you some pocket money, which wasn't very much back then in Ireland. We had punts, we had our own currency back then. And it was like I would get £1, which a pound note was huge. And my job was to go out and paint a rusty gate. And of course, she gave me a tin of paint. I went out and I painted over all the rust. And quickly she came out and she goes, okay, you're going to have to give me £1 because now I have to do this all over again. So I had to get a wire brush, clean down the gate and start over again. And it's exactly what I thought of about what we do with these new technologies. We try to use them to cover up what we're doing or the inefficiencies we have or the structures we have that are no longer useful. And Alex, I actually thought about you in this, where you and I were talking recently about your work, your current work, and you're always out in the field working with clients, as I said in an intro. And you said about how you've seen a huge shift in how organizations do work. CEOs, CTOs now in particular, who have a better seat at the boardroom table than ever before, but they're working with other senior leaders out with clients in the trenches to learn how to apply AI and AI-related value propositions directly with customers. I thought that was fascinating, that shift, because we rarely see that.
Yeah, it's been quite impressive to see that the best leaders I get to work with, they're really understanding that this is challenging their business model, but also their customers' business models and value propositions. And they have to get out of the building and work with customers to deeply understand, for example, in B2B, the work we do, where the CEO needs to deeply understand the P&L of the customer and how are they with AI and what AI can or could do, going to help them. So it's not enough to manage what you have anymore. You really need to get into the trenches. So I think it's this revival of the entrepreneurial CEO, almost Steve Jobs style, maybe not with the same kind of aura, but definitely that kind of working where CEOs are becoming product people again. And I think that's very healthy. Like we know that from the startup world, but we don't know that from the Fortune 100. So I think this is really a fundamental shift in how we need to lead our organizations.
I was reading recently, there's a new book about the Steve Jobs next years, and just because you mentioned him there, it was really interesting how he was revered by technology providers. So Canon, for example, flew him out to Japan because they thought that he would see some use for technologies they had created or invented that they wouldn't know, and that's how they came along with the optical drive. And just because you mentioned that, but it brings to mind Rita's work. So Rita has a new book coming out, roughly this idea of a permissionless organization where the decision-making is changed to those people who are at the edges, those people who are working at the edges of the organization in the field, learning at the point of field and having to make those decisions at the time. And Rita, I pulled a quote from a comment you actually left on somebody else's post recently. You said, "The old model of the firm, replete with hierarchies, bureaucracies, and the mechanisms of control that made mass production feasible, is no longer fit for purpose. In a digital world or an AI world, companies centered around a common mission or values have a strategic edge." I thought that was absolutely important because it talks to everything we're talking about here. It's not just a case of understanding and deploying this new technology. It's not just a case of what Alex said there, where you're getting out and you're making decisions with your clients. It changes the entire structure of your organization.
We were talking a little bit before this began about where are we in historical terms. And I would argue that we are in the midst of a great transition from the world of mass production, where hierarchy and bureaucracy are actually a pretty good way of connecting things if your goal is making 1 million identical widgets, right? In which case you want everybody doing exactly what they're supposed to do at exactly the right time. You want decisions to be centralized because advantage comes from economies of scale and. And the world we're moving into is where we're seeing services replacing products, where we're seeing, units of value creation are small teams and even individuals. And we've got our fabulous story of a guy, a single Israeli guy who worked for 6 months by himself to create a product that got sold to Wix for $80 million. Like, where is that in the world of mass production? It doesn't exist. So we're right in the middle of a transition, and these transitions are incredibly messy. And all the things we're seeing, massive income inequality, political turmoil, the rise of populism, all that, we've seen this before, at least 5 times in these transitions in capitalism.
Alex, you talked to me before about that when we had a chat recently about the idea of a 1-person unicorn or a 2-person unicorn, where you're using all these agents to run your company, to market your company, etc. Maybe we'll say a word on that before we come to Usman.
Yeah, I think what you have at your fingertips as an individual without actually having a ton of technological knowledge is pretty amazing, right? So the web was made accessible by Tim Berners-Lee and then Netscape, and then all that came afterwards. Then Amazon, with Amazon Web Services, made web infrastructure, really powerful web infrastructure, accessible to everybody. And then with ChatGPT, we kind of launched something that was around for a long time, but it became available to a much larger group of people. These powerful AI tools that anybody can use. So I think today, as a small team, maybe individual, definitely as a small team, you can do things that were only accessible to hundreds or thousands of people before. That is exactly what Rita is talking about. That's a fundamental shift. And you will see a lot of people who have to reorient, right? They're going to lose their jobs. Are they going to get new ones? Are the same people going to get new ones? So It's a fundamental shift. It's a huge opportunity for anybody who's entrepreneurial. And it's a real challenge for anybody who, can't or doesn't want to adapt. Because it's not a question of wanting to. Some people just can't because they don't have the means, access to all these things. So it's an interesting time, but definitely, as Rita said, it's going to be quite turbulent, this transition.
You were talking there about the reskilling or unlearning actually that has to happen for a lot of people. And many people don't have a great experience of education, but also we've been educated for that world that no longer exists. And Rita, I wondered about this. So if you have leaders giving decision-making power to the edges of the organization, they may question, well, where does my power or status come from if that's the case now? And I wondered how you're seeing leaders deal with that conundrum.
Oh, well, this was actually a big surprise in the research I've been doing for the new book. So I guess I went into it with the assumption that it would be the, Lee Iacocca principle, right? Which was my success in life comes because I hire people that are smarter than me and I get out of their way. And that's what I thought I'd find. And it turns out that's not the case at all. What I see is leaders that are deeply, deeply into the weeds in terms of the business. Now, what's interesting is they're not command and control. So you take somebody like Jensen Huang at NVIDIA. Everybody in the company at the end of the week puts out a memo, which is their top 5 things they're going to do the next week. It's called TFTs. And these are all posted to distribution lists. And Wang has access to these distribution lists. And what he does on Sunday nights is he takes a couple of hours and he just randomly goes through people's top 5 things. And it could be somebody on the front line. It could be somebody more senior. It's kind of random. And he personally makes comments on them. He makes observations. But what I think is the key thing is he's directly connected to the edges. So we're seeing a difference in the way power is defined. It's influential power. It's not command and control power. And it's definitely not perks and, all that kind of thing. So an interesting organizational design is something they're experimenting with at Bayer. And Bayer's been through terrible times, horrible acquisition, bad lawsuits, really tough competitive challenges. And Bill Anderson was brought in as their CEO to turn things around. And my friend Michael Lurie is sort of his right-hand man. He's their chief transformation officer, I think his title is. But one of the things that they're doing is they're putting the company on 90-day cycles. What they've done is they've separated out your work into your professional home and your task activities. And your job, your promotion, your pay, all that stuff is decided by your professional home, not by the exact tasks that you're doing. And why I think this is so interesting is it reduces the return on politics tremendously. If you're not brown-nosing the person to whom you report, theoretically, what is your incentive to spend time on politics? You might as well do the best work you can because that's what's going to get acknowledged in your professional home.
It's so interesting that because it's the biggest challenge for innovation officers or transformation officers is they might be creative, they might know how to get things done, but they can't speak politique or navigate the corporate maze that is most organizations' political status. But I wanted to come to Usman because, Usman, you wrote a brilliant article recently, and I love the title of your blog, Framebreak, this idea, because I love this saying, it's hard to read the label when you're inside the jar. But also a guy called Chuck House, a brilliant innovator who was at HP, he told me there's even a better one. He said, it's hard to see the picture when you're inside the frame. And I pulled a little quote from that. You said, speaking to this idea, the time saved on a specific output that requires twice the review time is not time saved. And what you're talking about here is when this structure is used, where now I can use these technologies like AI, I can use agents to do my work faster, but then it has to go to a layer where I don't have the permission to actually act. And we've seen some people got caught out from that badly, which has scared a lot of organizations. But this idea of overly tracking people or not giving them the permission to actually go and ship their work is a huge constraint. I'd love you to talk to this, and particularly this article that you recently wrote.
Yeah. In the article, I was talking about specifically this verification problem where we've sped up the work with the technology that is available to us, but the ability to now review the work and see whether it's the correct work is lagging behind. And the competence and the judgment required to review the work is the bottleneck in a lot of these places now. So how do we sort of create the infrastructure for this to happen. And the second part is you can speed up the work, which like a lot of firms are equipping their people to use these tools to produce faster. But if it's not impacting, because everyone's moving towards this outcome orientation way of billing and the unit of value. And I think these two factors are causing problems. One, the speed of work is increasing and we don't know whether it's correct or not. Second, even if you speed up and it's not impacting the outcomes that it's being created for, I think that's creating tension within the firm and it's causing a lot of problems that Rita spoke about, like the leverage ratio is being challenged now because there was so much. The pyramid was constructed so that you could bill for that production time. But if the cost of production compresses, the pyramid has a lot less to offer now.
And how are you seeing that, Ismail, in your work? How would you see that play out when it comes to like a CTO? I mentioned now, like a CTO should have always had a place at the boardroom table. A CHRO should have a boardroom place at the table, and they haven't always in most companies. And technology is often treated like an expenditure rather than a competitive advantage. And I wondered there, like one of the things I was trying to get at with that idea of the rusty gate, I recently was trying to get the max out of my Wi-Fi speed at home. And I rang the company. It was paying for a gig power on my Wi-Fi. And I wasn't getting it. And the guy goes, oh, you need to plug in and you need to go through the LAN. And I was like, okay. So I did that. It's still not working. I'm only getting about 500. And he goes, okay, well, what type of wire are you using? So I had this idea. I was like, oh my God. So firstly, the technology has to be capable of running that through itself. They don't tell you this stuff, of course. You're paying for a gig of speed. But I thought about that disconnect. And say, for example, the savvy CTO who's listening to this show and goes, I have been trying to tell him that for ages, that we need to upgrade our stack to be able to even run this powerful technology upon it. And that's the competitive advantage if we get ahead of other people. What's happening out there in the field?
Yeah, I mean, there's two or three things here I think we're thinking about. One is when we talk about this technology is a team now of agents and people working together. And when you think about that, the role of HR and IT is changing, even to the point where some organizations are looking at bringing the CHRO and CIO together, because the role becomes one of treating agents as you would an individual. You train them, you onboard them, you reinforce behaviors, you exit them when something new comes along. And so the technology people will be managing agents as if they were part of the team. So that's one point. Secondly, the role of the individual then in that loop, and there's lots of discussion, and there's some great discussion on what is the role of the human in the loop of a bunch of agents. And I really like the view of the human adds meaning to the loop. So technology can do whatever it wants, but it can still meet its measurable objective, and I think it's maybe what Usman was referring to, and miss its intended one. So this agentic drift discussion, right, where, for example, in procurement, you've told the technologies, go and get me the best price, reduce costs, and in doing that, it reduces partnerships with organizations that are really important to you, with organizations where you've got sustainable relationships, whatever it might be, right? So it's giving you what you asked for, but in doing so, it's gone away from the strategy and the meaning of what you were trying to do. So I think that becomes really important. And then the third aspect, and I'm sure Karen will have a view on this, is what our customers are worried about is this technology is amazing. It's easy to set up. Agents are almost free to create. The magic is in the workflow. But if you've now got hundreds of thousands of agents autonomous, working in your production environment, and you're in a regulated industry, how can you go back and have an audit trail and say, actually, not only are they behaving as I'm asking them to behave, but they're behaving as our organization mission and purpose needs them to behave. So I think as we go from brilliant technology to production-ready environments, there's some quite interesting people-related stuff. These are not technology, right? I think there's some people-related stuff we need to fix. And if anything in the world is doable now, there is the idea of imagination. What does native AI enterprise and process it look like? So everyone we're talking to, Aidan, is going back almost to base zero. If you're an insurer, what does a native AI insurer looks like? What's the role of the people and the role?
Absolutely love it. I was thinking about something. There's a quote by Tolstoy, and he said, "Everybody thinks of changing the world, but nobody thinks of changing him or herself." And that, I think it's easy to go, we should do that. And then you go, but your role's going to have to change. Your status, your power is going to have to change. And your colleague, great guy, Tom Rourke, he said to me one day about how people resist change. He said, you can't waterboard a horse. They know that idea of like Duncan the horse. You'll drink, goddammit. And I was thinking about that with resistance to using the technology. And Usman, you wrote about this recently. I was fascinating. And I mentioned to the panel, many of the panel hadn't heard this, where there's now metrics about using AI. So people are being measured on it. So what are they going to do? They're going to game the system to be using it just for the sake of using it versus actually seeking real value. And that forcing people to change never works. I'd love you to share your thoughts on that.
Yeah. I think the firm that we're referring to was in the FD, and it's a large firm that was tracking whether their employees were logging into AI tools and linking that to their promotions. And it just goes to show that there is this very large narrative to be AI enabled and how much you're adopting the technology. And there are metrics that you can put, like so many of my people now use AI tools. But I think that confuses what Ismail was talking about, that we have to start measuring how the work is changing, how the pricing structure is changing. Because if you're just simply tacking this on and saying utilization of AI tools has gone up without the invoice changing or without the delivery mechanism changing, then it's short-lived. And I think that's where the real opportunity is when I'm talking to companies, is that how has your pricing strategy changed, or how are you delivering this? And in the article that you were mentioning, there was a legal AI company that I referenced, which started to bill for their work on the documents that they provided versus the hours that it took. And these are starting from Rita's snow melts on the edges. And I love that saying, because it's going to start with these wedges that are in relatively deterministic workflows. But eventually the patterns will catch up, and you'll start to see this drift even further within more complicated cases.
Speaking of snow melting from the edges, it's a natural segue to come to Rita. Rita writes a lot about this idea. But Rita, I noticed one of your most popular articles, I follow your thought sparks avidly, and one of your most popular articles was recently about how the value of work changes with AI. And I'd love you to share both what you wrote about, but also the great interaction you had with people about that.
Yeah, the article was, I think that one came out in the Wall Street Journal, and it was AI and the death of the billable hour. And the billable hour is, in many industries, law in particular, is almost sacrosanct. You split your hour into 6 intervals, and then you bill clients for each of those intervals that you consume. Well, with AI, that becomes a meaningless metric. And the billable hour has a lot of negatives, right? It punishes efficient work. It causes people to look at the wrong outcomes. It causes people to, spend more time than they actually need to. It's sort of subject to gaming and all kinds of things. And increasingly, clients are pushing back on it. And so the consequences for, as we talked about, the pyramid structure of a lot of professional service firms is going to be challenged, and people are going to be billing more for outcomes rather than the intent. So the locus of value really changes when you're billing for what's the outcome that you created rather than the time it took you to get there. And I think that's a huge, huge shift. So the way that I look at AI and the productive capacity of organizations, the analogy I would use is it's very much when electricity was introduced. So before you had electricity, you designed your production facilities in a linear fashion because you relied on one power source. So a steam engine or a river or a windmill or something, and everything was interdependent. And that was the logic that dominated factory production since the first factories were ever built. Well, once you had electricity, each machine could now operate independently. And it was a completely different organizing logic that was needed. And the factories that were built either after the introduction of electricity or those that converted over achieved massive productivity gains. But it took 40 years before that became the norm. And the reason, I think, and I think we're in this moment with AI, is, you have to write off an awful lot of stuff that you've learned to do. You have to depreciate a lot of existing assets. You have to unlearn a lot of painfully gained tacit knowledge. I mean, there's just all this stuff that you have to, segue into the past in order to capture the productive capacity of what's to come. And I think we're in that moment of, a lot of organizations, they won't tell you this, but, they're deeply afraid of having to admit how much is tied up in these legacy systems.
And a place that shows up is a totally reshuffling of the business model, Alex, and how the very business model that might have got you competitive advantage today is now gone, to Rita's term, it's transient. It's gone much quicker than it used to be. And dealing with that. So firstly, you're looking at the technology, you're going, we have to integrate this technology some way to have a competitive advantage. But doing that without looking at the entire structure and below the rusty gate, removing that rust to see what's at the surface, what the base of it is, where a lot of companies go wrong.
It's quite interesting, that with this change in technology, we kind of repeat the mistakes from the past. Like we need to go back to the fundamentals, the business fundamentals. They do not change. Who's the customer? How are we creating value? How are we capturing value with the business model? And then hopefully, how are we creating value for the society? Those fundamental questions do not change. Now, with AI and everything that comes with it, I think the content of those fundamentals is really, really changing, but the questions aren't. Now, when you have an established business model, it's extremely hard to challenge those fundamentals because the shift, will require you to completely revamp your business model. And we can go back to this really boring example. Everybody talks about Kodak, but think of it. They actually committed innovation suicide because they invented a technology, the digital camera, but they forgot to reinvent the business model. So they never shifted their assets from the old world of analog film to the new world. And it's more complicated than that, but they didn't do that. Now, today, look at, the big service firms, you take Accenture, Deloitte, and so they're facing an enormous challenge. And some of them will say, yeah, but we do AI. Yes, but if your business model is fundamentally changing, you might actually be committing innovation suicide, like Kodak did, because you're adopting the technology, but you're not fundamentally changing your business model. So when your business model relies on hundreds of thousands of people, well, guess what? It's going to change radically. So it's not enough to actually look at the technology, to embrace it, to create new products. You need to fundamentally question your business model. And that's the leadership that's required today, is to lead your company from today to tomorrow. And that's not going to happen with the ways we've done it so far, because many business models are going to get disrupted. And to a certain extent, it's interesting to see some of the physical companies are probably less prone to disruption than the technology companies. So you'd be surprised. I think we're going to see some interesting companies disappearing, and some that we would have thought, oh, they're old school, they're going to disappear. They might actually rise if they do the right moves.
I love that. I had this vision of, I should generate this with AI, this idea of arranging the deck chairs on the Titanic, but using those Boston Dynamics dogs to do it, just push them around the place, powered by AI, do it quicker. But it also raises a nice juxtaposition. So I was thinking about this. So we're talking here a lot about reshuffling or reorganizing or recalibrating an existing incumbent firm. But maybe we'll compare it to, what does an AI native firm look like? Rita mentioned, for example, that guy with his 80 million startup in a few months sold on to Wix. But I wonder, what does that look like? So the value of being born into this AI as an AI native means you don't have any of that legacy we talked about. You don't have any of that psychological debt. We talk a lot about technological debt. But Ismail, from your perspective, what are you seeing that's AI native, AI first, where you don't have any of that legacy and you can just build and get out of the blocks.
Yeah. And, Alex, I think I'm going to build on what Alex is saying around my own industry and what's happening with that. Only 12 months ago, if you had hundreds of thousands of people and you could do labor arbitrage, you had competitive advantage. Now it's a competitive disadvantage because you've got to get rid of hundreds of thousands of people. Because the customer expectations is that when you used to turn up with 10 people, 7 of them undergrads, on the pyramid, now their expectation is you turn up with 3 people and a consult tool who does the work. So the whole economics of how you do the work, how you yourself, and Usman's done a ton of work in this space, how you're going to cost for it, and then how you're going to share some of that value with the customer, because there's an expectation that some of that value will be shared. And yet you still end up with a business where you're meeting market expectations, albeit market expectations are changing in that the margins for this sort of business, I think, are going to be closer to a software business than a services business. So, you talk about disruption. This is about as disruptive as it gets in our own industry. And I think, somebody on the panel mentioned the winners and the losers might not be what we think they are. We're sat with 20,000 people offshore thinking, how do we compete with 800,000 people sat in competitor A, B, and C? And now we're saying 20,000 people, that's amazing because we can compete. We don't need more than 20,000 people. And so I think as you think about native AI, again, in our industry, we're thinking about autonomous operations. So our customers expect, they used to have managed services, outsourcing, loads of people doing DevOps, doing call center management, et cetera. Basically, you've just got people adding meaning to what the technology does, if what a native environment is going to look like. We've got a more and more requirement for curiosity and creativity to help our customers think about what a native AI insurer or a bank or a manufacturer might look like. And it doesn't look like anything we'd imagined in the past. And that's where our customers are going to need help. They don't need help in developing code. They don't need help in running operations. They need help in imagining what it might look like. And then when they're running the operations, they need guarantees that it's going to be secure, it's going to be scalable, it's going to be transparent, and it's where it's regulated, you can prove the audit trail around regulation. So I think the places at which we add value for us as an enterprise native service provider changes to the two ends of help me imagine and help me run, because everything else is automated. And the customer who are buying now, what we're finding is technology budgets used to sit predominantly in IT. Of course, CMO and lots of businesses have some budget. The AI budget is sitting all with the business users because it's all about outcomes. So the customers who are talking to the service providers also are changing as well.
That's a really interesting point, that the owner of that budget also changes. Like even in your consulting work, that changes how decisions are made and who is responsible for that decision. And decisions get made faster, which I always find so annoying for the poor person who was trying to get the budget in the first place. Alex, maybe we'll link to you on that before I come to Usman, because you're experiencing this firsthand out in the field and also with your own company where you're changing structures inside the company. But I thought there about what Ismail was saying. If you're AI native, or even if you're trying to be, you have to take a first step. And what is that first step? Is it, I start with some type of trial, I start with some process that I'm going to get out of the blocks with and understand that and go, okay, now I have a feel for this, now I can scale it, just like you would with product development, etc.
Even take a step back. So I'll give you a silly example. Like if you're a skincare company and you have an established brand, well, you better be afraid of the skincare company that's going to have access to personalized health data, because you're going to have consumers who are going to want to have skincare, in particular the young generation that, know what technology can do. They want skincare that is for them. Now, we're still far away from having a drug developed for your personal DNA, but definitely recommendation engines can do much better. So if you don't know that and you don't create alliances to have the right partnership, you might actually build stuff that's not going to have impact because you were just blocked from market access. So before building anything, I take a step back and ask, how is AI going to disrupt your company? Because I'll tell you, the startups, they're going to do it. And because there are 100 or 1,000 in your field, well, one's going to get it right. And now you're one big company trying to get it right. Well, you better, kind of start from the strategic lens, because as an established company, you have some assets. You better use those because you don't have the speed. Like, I don't know any large companies who have the same speed as the startups, So I'd go back to some strategic thinking, then of course not overthink, but then get started. And I think, take the startup approach and what Rita said, get, like 100 teams out there to start. Oh, but 100 teams, it's a big investment. No, it's not, because startups, they start small. So you need, maybe $1 million, which is nothing for a large company, and have 100 teams trying out. One of them is going to get it right. So you do the same kind of investments like a venture capital firm. So, first create a strategic frame, and then get as many, people in your company and maybe partnerships going so that one is going to emerge as the winner. Because no leader can pick the winner. Venture capitalists can't pick the winner. They invest in a portfolio. So the same kind of thing, and really, emphasizing what Rita said before and what you're working on, Rita, in your new book, the power structures are going to change. You do need to decentralize. So yes, you need a top-down leader in the sense that they understand product, they can give the strategic direction, they can give the vision, but they don't pick the ideas. You have teams out there who are much closer to the customer, who are much closer to the technology. You need to enable hundreds of teams and hundreds of partners, and the winner will emerge. So, I don't really see that really happening yet with established companies, at scale. Few have gotten close, but I think it's going to be fun to see how leadership changes and how, what Rita is talking about, that's complete change of leadership structures. We are going to see, some unexpected winners, I think.
And I want to come to Usman. I want to come to you about the incumbent advantage that Alex said. What assets do you have that can be used or redeployed in a different way? But Rita, while Alex mentioned it there, that decision-making pushed down to the edges that we talked about, I wonder, what are you seeing? So in your work, even in executive education, how are leaders reacting to this? Because there's got to be some resistance to that, because maybe I could back ideas that I liked or products that I liked in the past, and everybody feels that off me inside the boardroom. I may think that it's a democracy, but I'm actually having a huge influence on what gets picked or what's not, versus what Alex talked about there.
Courageous companies are those that are doing what Alex said, which is you get out there, you introduce things to the market, and then the market sends you signals about whether whether that thing is liked or not. So one of my favorite examples, I talked about a born digital company, is a South Korean fintech company called Toss. And they were founded by a dentist, and they're organized around solving this friction problem in money. It's like, why is money so hard to deal with? And they were successful in getting the South Korean government to change the way that they were regulated, which is a huge advantage. And they have no sort of formal hierarchy. They're organized around teams with what they call directly responsible individuals. And the teams take on and release work as the market suggests to them. So a great example of this is they had a YouTube channel, so regular financial advice. And then another team had the idea, well, wait a minute, there's a whole nother side of money. It's cultural, right? So how do ballet dancers get paid? And how does money filter into sports? And what do rock bands do with money? And so it's like a cultural side of money YouTube channel. Now, in a typical bureaucracy, right, what you would have had, you would have had a YouTube czar, and the YouTube czar would have given the thumbs up or thumbs down to whatever was introduced to the market. In Toss, they try it. And because they're all digital, and they'll tell you 50% of what they introduce to the market doesn't stick because for whatever reason, the customer doesn't want it. But this particular YouTube channel has now been a huge success, and it's gaining traction with people who really don't care about financial advice, but are very, very interested in how their favorite rock band makes money. I think it's a beautiful example of what's possible when you do give this sort of freedom to operate at the operating level of the company.
I think, what Rita's saying really illustrates something that we're going to see more of is industry boundaries melting down. So you won't be able to say, well, I'm in retail banking. Well, now that sounds to me like entertainment. So what I think, has happened in some sectors like technology is going to happen everywhere. You're not going to be able to think industry anymore, right? Or industry forces. That's 1985, Michael Porter 5 Forces. Like, that's great stuff, but that's 1985. Like with AI, the world has changed. And you are not the victim of any force anymore. If you are a leading company, you're creating the spaces. And today you have these different companies competing in similar spaces. If we take entertainment, you have like a bank competing against Apple, competing against Amazon, competing against Facebook. And it's really, those boundaries are melting down. And again, it goes back to business basics. Who's the customer? How are we creating value? How are we capturing value? That's the unit of analysis, which sounds basic, but it's not, because when industry boundaries are gone, you have hundreds of thousands of choices to make every day as a leader. What is my business? And that's becoming fuzzier and fuzzier, and AI is going to accelerate that.
Isn't that the huge problem, though, Alex, that you've created an advantage? You have had an emergent strategy, and then maybe you post-rationalize it as, no, that was deliberate. And it rarely is deliberate in the first instance. And to Rita's point there about TOS is that they found what worked. They didn't actually go out with a deliberate strategy. It emerged which worked out of all these different experiments. And that organizational drag is huge. And I wondered, Usman, from your work working with clients, what does it look like? Where do they start, in your view? What have been the most successful ones? I know you can't give away secrets, but some themes that have arisen for you.
In my writing, I've been differentiating between the incumbents and the newcomers, naturally, as both Rita mentioned and Alex, that when you have less of that drag, you can definitely move faster, reach those points easier. For the incumbents, they have the distribution, they have the brand. That's their advantage right now. I think the biggest thing would be the incentive structures within these companies to change over there. In lots of services companies, partner leverage, how the firm goes, promotions based on tenure, like lots of the way that the firm is set up right now from an architectural point of view is going to continue to create drag. The example that we were saying earlier about checking logins of AI tools is a symptom of this. We are trying to fit this change within the structure because, let's face it, these incumbent firms make a lot of money still. Clients are still paying for them. And I think we're also discounting. Clients don't necessarily want to change as well because lots of them like the predictability of the billable hour because it provides procurement an easier way how to bill and get things done. So the supply and demand side is changing. What Alex said, going and looking at a person's P&L, understanding their business, seeing how that's changing. And I think that's the challenge. So for the incumbents, I think you can take the measures like the hire, or very recently what Block has recently done. Jack Dorsey sort of has famously said, he's going to get rid of the middle management loop. He's going to replace it with what he's calling an intelligence layer. Humans are going to go to the edges where they're going to make judgment calls. That might work for a company which has 10,000 people. But as Ismail said, if you have 100,000 people or 200, or in some cases, 800,000 people, I don't think that's going to be very easy. And the second point Ismail made was around accountability. Are you going to stand behind the answer? What happens when the machine makes a fault? Who's going to take responsibility? I think large incumbent firms, especially in the services area, have large reinsurance books already in place to protect themselves from this. And clients trust that advice from these firms because they know that they have that backstop available to them. So for the professional services area, it's definitely going to be a lot slower from the larger corporate side for these change. And a lot of the existing revenue pipeline was sold on the old model. And I think that will also take a while for those to play out until they have new contracts based on new terms. So they're in a transitionary period where they've got to hold on to the old model, all while doing what Alex said, okay, you've got to spend the money, do all of this, but there's an incentive problem that needs to get solved. And this has to start from the top, I believe.
Isn't that it though? As a startup, you can't compete on scale, so you have to compete on innovation. And one of the things you're competing on is actually not legacy mindsets that exist inside organizations. Ismail, I thought about your book and the idea of from incremental to exponential, and how difficult, and I have so much empathy for an incumbent, how difficult it is not to get stuck in the incremental trap, because oftentimes they think they're being innovative, they think they're innovating, but like to the customer, there's no difference to the product, but they're putting all this time into actually driving down costs, putting a bit of extra technology in there to make it a little bit more efficient, but the customer just sees the same product. But it ultimately comes down to people, and it ultimately comes down to their resistance, how they're energized, how they're come around. Like I mentioned that Rita's comment earlier on about this common purpose or common mission. What are you? You're a leader. You have a huge group of people under your umbrella. What are you seeing there? What was the message that you would like to get through to them to be able to thrive in the world of AI?
Yeah, I think, and just to connect a couple of dots with what Alex said and what Usman said, I think if you're an incumbent, you've got inherent advantages that have previously maybe had not been advantages. So to go back to Alex's point around industries merging, the other thing that's happening is everybody has access to the same technology, the same learning models, the same data. So that's not where the competitive advantage is going to come from. The competitive advantage and where we're going to build moats, if you like, is specific data, business domain expertise, and context. And generally, if you're looking at a large enterprise, if we talk about some, we're working with 80 of the top 100 largest organizations in the world. When we talk to them, and yet they have disadvantages, this slow, they're bureaucratic, takes ages to implement new technology, but they have access to information about their clients and their industries that nobody else in the world has. They have access to data that in the past, you'd have to have a 12-month project to create a data pool. And now you can create an agent to go and get the data and do the work that you wanted to do. So some of the competitive things have changed because of the technology, which I think allows large organizations, if they can get out of their own way, to create vertical AI. Use what's available as commodity, use everything that everybody else has, but then take advantage of what only I have. Only I know how pharmaceutical works. For these customers, I've worked with them for 80 years. I have all the data and the ecosystem that nobody else has. How do I use that in the context of this new technology to provide native services that nobody else can? And that's the discussion we're having, where we are getting the C-suite to go from this is a huge threat to actually, if we think smartly, we may create new competitive advantage.
I thought I'd come to everybody just with your final thoughts that, as you wish here, what would be your elevator pitch to somebody who goes, hey man, I don't know what to do about this AI stuff. It's threatening my business. It's an opportunity, but I don't know how do they get started? So maybe as an incumbent in particular, maybe we'll go from who I can see on the screen. So Alex, I see you first there.
Yeah, I think, you got to ask yourself, where is competitive advantage going to come from in the next couple of years or decades? And I think very clearly it's going to come from your ability to reinvent yourself all the time, right? So Rita has pioneered this thinking, like transient advantage. So if you look at, you can love Amazon or hate Amazon, but one thing that they have systematically done is reinvent their business model all the time. They created new P&Ls, like with Amazon Web Services. So the competitive advantage is not going to come from a specific strategy anymore. To a certain extent, still from a business model, like think App Store, that's pretty dominant. It's hard to disrupt. But ultimately, it's going to come from your ability to reinvent yourself all the time. And that means you're running your business, you're doing incremental innovation, nothing wrong with that, with improving products, but it's not going to be enough. At the same time, simultaneously, you're inventing the future. And if you see the companies doing that, I mentioned Amazon, Netflix, No Rules Rule, the book by Reed Hastings, these are the companies that are going to stand out. They just know the world is changing. We need to reinvent. And that goes for individuals as well. And that's going to be probably the hardest. the world is going to change. So what are the life skills we're going to get? I think most of it is actually not going to be the skills we learn at school. Have a good fight, not hate the other person. Have a good conversation, be able to give and provide and take feedback. Those are the ultimate skills that are required to constantly change and adapt and reinvent yourself. So reinvention, I think we're all tired of hearing those kinds of words, all those buzzwords. But the reality is that's going to be the ultimate competitive advantage, the ability to reinvent yourself.
I'm still working on it, Alex, still working on it. We all are. We're always works in progress. Usman, what's your piece of advice?
I think for the incumbent, the advice is looking at a particular service line and figuring out whether the 50th client for that service is markedly better than the first by encoding the work into software and systems instead of headcount. So if you can actually decouple that revenue growth, get costs down as a function of that, then I think that you're building a system that learns. And I believe that's going to be where a lot of the alpha is going to come from. Like Ismail mentioned, that there's a lot of data that gets unlocked as you do this work. And if you can actually use that to make every next deliverable better, that error correction loop actually becomes extremely valuable. For the individuals, I think it's getting closer to impact. Both the alpha school and what Alex mentioned, it's going away from necessarily the classroom to actually putting yourself out there, putting work out there, getting feedback loops running from doing the work. And we've created too many abstractions for young people today. They're too far away from the impact. If they can get closer to that impact, they're going to accelerate the rate at which they will learn and reinvent themselves.
I love it. Rita, I was thinking there with Usman when he said about the data that Ismail mentioned, the data that you have, and that's almost like breadcrumbs. And in your book, The Entrepreneurial Mindset, you talked about this idea of stepping stones and scouting. And I'll come to you because you have so much experience, not just talking to executives and coaching executives as a college professor in Columbia, but also your own work with Valise. You work with clients, you give keynotes, you run workshops. What are you seeing there from the people who are most primed to succeed?
There's a balance of investment, and this has been alluded to before, but I talk about investing in your core. That's absolutely important. That's job one. But then you need to be thinking about what are your new platforms that are candidates to be the future core. So if you look at a company like Adobe, when they went from selling shrink-wrapped software that you bought on disks to selling software that you could use in the cloud, that was a huge transition. It was a platform for future growth. And so you have to make a commitment to those things. And then you have options, which are small investments. As Alex said, you could have 100 of them, but they're tiny. They're small investments you make today that buy you the right, but not the obligation to make further investments in the future. And I think the companies that are getting this right have a really good feel for what's being invested in that spreads across their portfolios. Where I see companies really getting stuck, and this is something you can work on, is a disconnect between strategy, which when it's done right is pulling you into the future, budgeting, which all too often is just an anchor in the past, project governance, which is often not connected to either strategy or budgeting, and what people believe is going to get them ahead in the organization. And unless you can bring those things into alignment, you're going to have a great deal of trouble getting anything to happen. One final thought is, we know what disruption is, right? It's when something that used to be really hard to do becomes easy. And when something that used to be really inaccessible or expensive becomes affordable. And that simultaneously interferes with incumbents because it often removes the value from a lot of their existing assets. But it also creates enormous growth because if something's now simple to do and cheap, a lot more people can do it. And so it drives enormous growth. So I think you've really got to be looking for what are the spaces in which those dynamics are playing out.
Ismail, we'll come to you for your final word to incumbents in particular.
I think it's two or three things. One is this idea of organizations wanting to pass on the risk of introducing new technology to service providers. That time is gone. Nobody's done this before. Nobody has got counting references. So I think there's an opportunity for organizations to understand that this is going to be a collaborative journey where you are understanding and mitigating the risks together. The second thing is, I think, as I said before, I think the incumbents have this potential advantage of deep domain expertise. And so as a service provider, I would be saying, don't spend too much time thinking about what you're going to be as a native AI organization. Go and understand what your customer's going to be as a native organization and help them understand how they're going to get there. And the third point, I think one of the biggest dangers in getting there is separation of business and technology. I think those days have gone. And if you really want to do a technology project, that's fine. If you want to do a transformation, the integration of what it means for business and technology is going to be critical.
Been talking about this. This is a leadership decision. It's not an unknown in the sense that we actually know what kind of organizational structures we should starting to be put in place. It's really a question of courage and leadership, nothing else. So yes, there's a lot of unknown, but we actually know which structure which would be required. So I think that's the key maybe that was missing. Leadership, courage, and action is what's going to make the difference. Those who step ahead are going to lead. It's pretty straightforward.
I am so grateful to our brilliant panel for joining us on this inaugural, their very first one of these collaborations between the Kyndryl Institute and the Innovation Show. It's been an absolute pleasure. I hope you've learned a lot like I have. It's been a pleasure to have you on the show. Alec Osterwalder, Ismail Amla, Usman Sheikh, and Rita McGrath. Thank you for joining us.